All right, so now we're recording. So first of all, thanks to everyone for taking some time out of your day to join us on our October 2024 Lunch and Learn. I'm delighted to present Leah Merivaki, who's one of my collaborators on an NEH grant that we were unfortunately unsuccessful on last time around, but we're going to see if we can give it another go, hopefully in this upcoming cycle. So as is always the case with these things, I'm going to take a few minutes just to introduce her and a little bit about her background and research area. We'll turn it over to her presentation for probably 40 minutes or so, and then we'll certainly set aside some time for questions at the end. So Dr. Merivaki is an associate teaching professor at the McCord School of Public Policy and an associate research professor at the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown University. Dr. Meravaki's research interests lie in the intersection of election science, voter behavior, and political communication. She is working with academics, federal and state agencies, election officials, and pro-democracy stakeholders to understand how accurate and false information flows in the election information ecosystem and how trust-building communication campaigns can help build trust in the integrity of elections. Since 2020, Dr. Merivaki has been co-directing the Election Officials Communication Tracker, a massive data collection and analysis initiative that tracks all state and local election officials' communication efforts on social media. Dr. Merivaki received her PhD in political science from the University of Florida in 2016. And the title of her talk today is Building Healthy Information Ecosystems, Election Officials' Communications During the 2024 Election Cycle. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Merivaki.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you for having me today, and thank you all for taking the time. I know things are busy with the semester and life, so I really appreciate you that you're here. Let's see if I can share my screen, and we can get started. So you should be able to see my slides?
Yep.
Yeah? Great. So I will talk a little bit about myself and what motivates my research, lay out my research question, and I'm very excited to talk to you about one of the data collection projects that I have for running for the last 5 years, specifically with respect to election official communications, voter education, and I'll make my case about why it matters and how we find that it affects and shapes the information ecosystem as we describe it. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the election process. I hope all of you are voters. I'm not a citizen of the United States, but I care very deeply about elections in the US. Coming from Europe, I'm a citizen of Greece. I was very fascinated with the complex infrastructure of elections. Elections are not run by the federal government. The federal government occasionally supports. It is run by the states and at a very local level. There is a high diversity in election policy, administration, rules and practices, and that variation in practices and legislation shapes voter experiences, and voters have a very unique experience in depending on where they live. So a voter in Mississippi experiences and accesses elections very differently from someone who is in California or New York or in another state. So with this background, the questions that have been driving my research have to do with how election policy is designed and how it shapes the administration of elections. So those humans whose job is to actually implement them and increase access to voting and interact with voters, and how that administration of elections shapes the voter experience, especially in regards to making it easier or more difficult to participate in the voting process. And that framework has also made me think a little bit more about the information barriers to participation, how voters learn about elections, how they're able to build resilience against low quality and bad information, and overall the efforts to build a more resilient infrastructure that is can be inoculated from the online harms of misinformation, threats to election security, either by foreign actors or domestic actors, and overall shocks to the infrastructure that can really make or break the election process. A lot of this research revolves around design and policy, but it also includes a concept that we term as voter education, and more or less we all know what that means, to be educated and to learn about voting. But we make this argument about how voter education is very, and when I say we, I mean me and my collaborator. We work, Mara Satman-Lee from Connecticut College, we work on this together. Why voter education, and why should we be talking about it in the context of voting and participation? From a human rights perspective, voter education is important to build trust in the process and to facilitate access. If you don't know about elections and how it works, you're less likely to trust it. So it's an integral part, the right to be informed. From an empirical perspective, and from a research perspective, voter education is a fascinating term because it is what we call the mediator between election policy and participation. If voters are not aware how something works or if something exists, they're not able to use it, and they're not going to use it. And we have these conversations all the time with voters, but also with election officials and with legislators who make policies that they hope are going to increase access, but voters are not taking advantage of them because they don't know about them enough. There's also lack of something that I find it very exciting for my research, lack of voter education data sets, because there's not a set definition of voter education. So it's very difficult to operationalize, define, measure, and also find data to assess the impact of voter education on the voter experience broadly defined. So for the purpose of my research, I have been focusing more on what is a good enough proxy for voter education, and one of them is communication. So the more communications you produce about voting and how to vote, that is, to an extension, a way to capture voter education and outreach. So educating voters about elections and how to vote and how elections are kept safe and secure. So the substantive research question, from this framework is, where do election officials fit in the information environment, and how their efforts to inform voters and to educate them about how elections work build resilient ecosystems and improve the quality of democratic listening. And the reason why we use this term democratic listening is because there's so many evidence that the ecosystem is diluted because of bad information, and that voters are not really listening to election officials because elections are safe and secure. Especially 2020 was the most secure election we had, and we have a lot of evidence to substantiate why there was not rampant fraud and why election outcomes were accurate. But at the same time, we have a substantive portion of the population who is very skeptical about this and still does not trust that the elections are run securely and that election outcomes are accurate. So information disorder is a major problem, and with tangible impacts on the quality of democratic listening, which is one of them is the decline in confidence that elections are secure and that votes are counted, persistence of election denial, that elections are rigged and they're stolen, and a major impact that we have been seeing since 2020 is an increase in harassment and threats towards election officials and staff who are which causes a lot of stress and trauma, and also has increased turnover in the workforce. And that is obviously very concerning. Election officials are a very integral actor in this conversation because they are the authoritative sources of election information. And when I say election officials, I mean your local county clerk, the Secretary of State, who is the chief election officer in the state. But the local election officials are mostly what we're talking about because they're the ones who interact with voters on a daily basis. In Mississippi, that's your circuit clerk most often. That's the one that you go to register to vote, probably to request your absentee ballot. The election commissioners in Mississippi, they run elections, they train, they recruit poll workers, they staff polling places. Those are the ones that we interact with more closely on a day-to-day. And as administrators, they have a commitment to running safe, secure, and free elections. And they know the election process. So in the information ecosystem, they have a unique role because they know and because they do the work. This is an example of communications, and I made it relevant to Mississippi. I expect that all of you know that Michael Watson is the Secretary of State. Michael Watson is also a member of the National Association of Secretaries of State. And this is an association of election officials the chief election officials across the country. They do some common programming and efforts. One of them is a Trusted Info project, where it is intended to build trust in the process by communicating that election officials are the trusted source of information and that elections are safe and secure. So this is one example of some of the communications put out by the Secretary of State's office, alerting voters about the harms of online misinformation and AI, and also some information about what the process is in Mississippi from start to finish. The journey of the ballot is one way to talk about it. So this is just an example of what we mean by communications. So the theoretical foundation for this is, as I said before, the building resilience and improving the quality of democratic listening. And for this, for those research questions, we follow a systemic approach to the literature of deliberative democracy, where we don't have an individual impact where one person speaks and the other one listens directly and changes their opinion, but it's more of a systemic community level deliberative democracy framework, where we have election officials and they play a role in the community. They are established experts, and their efforts make a difference in informing voters. We identify in the literature, my work identifies educative effects. So when election officials talk about elections and they inform voters, voters are less likely to make mistakes and complete processes successfully, from filling a paper voter registration application to requesting and submitting and returning a mail ballot that will count. And also communications about trust, they also make a difference in building confidence that elections are safe and secure. So for the purpose of our work, we conceptualize and we consider those outcomes as positive evidence that there is listening. So voters, when they pay attention and they're exposed to these messages, they do indeed listen, and that is good for democracy, and it improves the democracy, and it's evidence of democratic listening. So how do we move from this theoretical framework, which it is intuitive, right? Education makes a difference, and it improves outcomes, and it helps democracy, and it builds a more robust democratic society. But how do we move from the theory to measurement of a term that is very difficult to define and operationalize? So I spoke about communications before. We have over 8,000 local election jurisdictions in the United States. So as you can understand, and not a centralized database of what they do and how they communicate with voters. So it is a very difficult endeavor to actually map all the different ways that election officials do voter education. So one helpful way to do that is by measuring their presence on social media, especially since 2020 with COVID. A lot of officials turn to social media to communicate with voters, to mobilize them, to communicate emergency measures, be it about COVID, be it about other weather emergencies. So the first thing to do is to map the presence. How many of our local and state election officials, this map here shows the local election officials' presence across the United States on whether they have Facebook, X, or Instagram. And as you will notice, there's a lot of white there. The areas, the states with gray, are the ones where elections are run at a very, very local level, and it is very complicated to track their social media presence, and it's basically non-existent. There are very few that have social media presence. But the takeaway from this is that there are substantial number of jurisdictions in the United States that are not active on social media. Now, that doesn't mean that those do not do voter education, of course, but it can give us a nice idea about where information might be more accessible. And we can learn about what election officials do in those jurisdictions, and we can start to understand how voter education is done and how it varies, and also whether efforts to educate voters are effective in different measures that we're interested in. So this is what led to the this is part of the origin story of what we call the communications tracker, the data collection project that my team and I have been working on since 2020. Starting with this database of election officials' presence on social media, what we did is we started thinking about tracking the content that they share on those major mainstream platforms. And what we do, we track the content shared across time. So if I can give you an estimate, between August and September, election officials, both state and local, have shared over 35,000 messages on this platform. So it's a lot of content to go through. And we label these posts, and our hope is to capture all the content shared between August and December 2024 in this cycle. So basically the major activity happening during the election cycle, from the beginning of voter registration to mail voting, to election day, to post-election processes, which we anticipate that they're going to be very controversial as they were in 2020. So this project is funded by Public Agenda for this cycle. In 2022, we ran the project for the first time with help from the MIT. And to be able to do this work, we are collaborating with the Algorithmic Transparency Institute that runs a platform called Junkipedia, which is a way to be able to track misinformation. And for our purposes, we have been using it to access and content this content. So because we're experts in election science and we have been doing this for a long time, we have developed a taxonomy of labels from, is this post about voter registration? Is this post about mail voting? Does it talk about trust? Does it talk about outreach to communities? Does it include visuals and links, and is it accessible? So different ways to capture both process, but also the type, the content, and communication strategies that we have seen being used by election officials. So this has been informed and updated based on research, practice, and election official input. And the platform that we use allows us to code in real time on the platform. So we have student coders and the researchers, and there's a lot of process behind that to make sure that we are all on the same page in their coder checks and training to make sure that when we label content, we'll capture the same thing. And being at Georgetown has allowed me to work with some data science students, and we're experimenting this cycle with some automated coding because there's so much content to go through, and we're trying to streamline some of these processes, but not replace them. So what coding means and what it looks like, I wanted to showcase this work because I think it's very cool. So this is one example of content that we capture on the platform that we track on social media and what labeling means. So the post to the left is a recent post from Flagler County. There's a lot of weather emergencies there, and they're going through another one right now. So on the bottom of this both images, you will see labels highlighted in red. Those are the labels that have been assigned for each post, and they capture content and themes associated with a specific post. On the left side, one of the things you're going to see that it's an emergency response. So we capture whether there are communications resulting from emergencies that take place in an election cycle. In this case, it's about Helene, whether there are links included and whether they're clickable, whether they talk about specific aspects of the election process that we want to capture. And then on the right-hand side, we try to capture also efforts to debunk and pre-bunk misinformation and to build trust in the process. So the labeling that we do, we are able to export, but this is what it looks like. So they're not mutually exclusive categories, but I just wanted to give you an example of some of the themes that we're trying to capture with our labeling process, that are some very descriptive, like what is the topic that is being discussed, but also some more subtle signaling communication strategies that requires a human eye to be able to capture. And that's why we're doing this mostly manually. So what do we do with the data? This is my favorite part. I mean, all of it I enjoy, of course. But one thing that we really try to do with this data is to inform the public, inform election officials, get this data out to the world so that we can inform on how election officials communicate with voters. We are trying to rapidly communicate with any stakeholders about what we see from social media and any patterns that we observe with respect to any misinformation narratives and how those translate to communications. As part of this grant, we have put together a website, and we produce bi-weekly briefs of the data we collect. So we provide data analytics and a newsletter kind of to showcase our work, because we hope that this project is going to stay, but we have to persuade funders to give us money so that we can run it, because it requires a lot of labor and time. But very importantly, we do a lot of hypothesis testing. So all of this data collection, other than its descriptive purpose, it is aimed to, we produce, variables of interest, and we can evaluate relationships between those metrics and outcomes. So one of the straightforward hypotheses that we have formed, and those are based on 2022, and we're going to run them again in 2024, are whether we observe any listening. And one way that we conceptualize listening is that when voters are in ecosystems where election officials are part of, and they are increasing their communications, and therefore the exposure to this information and likelihood to be exposed to this information, we hypothesize that opting to get informed and selecting that your election officer is a top information source is one way to conceptualize listening, that you're aware the messenger exists. And we're also forming hypotheses that have to do with the message itself, tailored to trust. Because one thing that we really care about and that we have been concerned with is the decline in voter confidence. And again, voters are very confident that their personal vote cast is counted because they have a more direct experience with their ballot. Either they cast it in person, or they put it in a Dropbox, or they deliver it somewhere. In Mississippi, you vote absentee in person, right? Even if it's on a paper. So that experience is explaining why voters trust the process when it comes to their own ballot. But what we see is that a tangible decline when we ask voters, do you feel confident that votes in your community or votes in your state or votes nationwide are counted accurately? We see a stark decline. And the question is why, of course, but also how do we restore trust that votes everywhere are counted and that elections are safe no matter the state you're in. So one way that we use this data is to measure and construct what we call trust building variables. So explicit mentions of trust messaging campaigns like the Trusted Info campaign that I mentioned before, and evaluate whether those are associated with higher confidence for voters who live in jurisdictions and states where their election officials are prioritizing those communications on social media. And again, social media is not the only way to do voter education, but it's one way that we can measure it. And particularly among those who are more skeptical to election integrity, either because they believe fraud is rampant, either because they supported candidates who are actively undermining election integrity. How about those voters? Are there any can we identify any effects of those communications in moving the needle among the specific population who is more prone to be skeptical and to not express confidence in election integrity? So what this means in terms of constructing our outcomes of interest. So one, as I mentioned before, is selecting the state election office or the local election office as a top information source. And the top 3 information sources specific to the data that we have. And then the 2 that we're very interested in is expressing confidence in statewide ballot accuracy, particularly because it is significantly lower compared to personal voter confidence across the state. So voters, again, are less likely to express confidence that votes in their state were counted, but they're more likely to express confidence that their vote counted accurately. And also evaluating some educative effects. Are voters whose election officials communicate about voting and how to vote more, and they're exposed to that information, do they learn about voting? Are they less likely to hold inaccurate beliefs about illegal voters, illegal citizens voting, or voter ID being required, or felons being able to vote? So some of those policy-oriented questions that are more associated with integrity, and voters have a lot of misconceptions about, including whether you have to speak English to participate in voting. And existing data sets out there. So 2022, we used the pre-election trusted messenger survey that the Bipartisan Policy Center ran in October 2022, and the post-election survey run by the Survey of the Performance of American Elections. Though the Survey of the Performance of American Elections is the most comprehensive election administration and voter experience survey out there. It's a public opinion survey asking about questions from whether you voted or not, of course, which is validated, to did you have any issues at the polling place? Did you have an interaction with your poll worker? Overall positive or negative voter experiences? Do you trust your election official? Do you trust the outcome of the election? So drawing from voter experience and attitudes to understand voter confidence. And we're going to replicate this work in 2024. We have not done that yet because those surveys have not yet been run, and we don't have an election yet. To flesh a little bit more these educative effects, we also have a survey, a collaborative survey in CES, the Cooperative Election Study Survey, which has a common core questions about participation and attitudes, but researchers are able to add in more questions in the post-election wave, and that's where we ask our election knowledge questions, and we hope to understand that a little bit better. So this is an example of what the data look like. These are data from a 2022 tracker where we graph the variation in trust building communications and usage of the trusted info hashtag on Facebook across state election official accounts. This work is forthcoming in State Politics and Policy quarterly, but this is an example that really shows the variation in those communications. So the light gray shows the all content shared, so the activity on this platform in 2022 by state election official accounts on Facebook, and the darkest one is the communications about trust. So messages that say, this is how we keep elections secure. We do post-election audits, we do security trainings, all the safeguards that keep elections secure. And the darker gray are posts that include the hashtag trusted info, which was part of the major campaign in 2022, and it's again in 2024, encouraging states and local election officials to use that hashtag to kind of signal to voters about, go to your election office, they're your trusted source. So, believe us when we say that elections are secure because we're your trusted source. So this visual gives a very nice example of how what social media communications look like in terms of the volume, and that some states are very, very active on social media, but they may not talk about trust that much. And the question, of course, is, does this all matter, right? Does it matter if you spend a lot of time talking about trust in your communications, or versus talking about other stuff such as Labor Day and registration deadlines, right? Not explicitly connecting process and security to other parts of the election communications operation. So we have a few papers out right now based on data that we collected in 2022. And I'm happy to report that we find evidence to support our hypotheses, all of our hypotheses. We do find that in jurisdictions where election officials are more active in communicating about elections and voting, voters are more likely to include them on their top 3 as an information source. We're replicating that survey again to make sure that this sticks. And we're trying to understand a little bit better how election officials are part of that information seeking behavior, and whether there are any differences between state and local election officials as sources of information. And we also find robust evidence, because we did that in 2020, we did that in 2022, and we're going to do that again in 2024. We do find evidence that trust-building communications increase voter confidence. So in those jurisdictions where the election officials were actively and prioritizing trust-building communications, individuals were more likely to express higher confidence, and they're very confident their votes in their state counted. And of course, community and local, we find those evidence too. We also find some evidence that they don't completely reverse election denial, but those voters, and we measure that, voters who voted for Trump in 2022, that's not the ideal, but it's a helpful proxy, because there's a high relationship between Trump advocating for rigged elections and election denial and voters supporting Trump, rather than capturing that by just a Republican Party affiliation. And we do find some evidence that there is some Trump 2022 voters were way less likely to express confidence in election integrity, but when in those jurisdictions where they were exposed to these messages, they expressed higher overall confidence compared to those whose election officials were not communicating about trust. And of course, because we care very deeply about sharing our findings with the community, in 2022, we did a series of events to communicate those findings, to work with election officials on how to improve messaging, particularly when it comes to trust, because that's something that we really, really care about, and building some capacity with stakeholders on how to communicate and how to better amplify the messages shared, and the efforts done by the election official community to get the word out to voters, and also to build trust in that elections in their state and in all the states are accurate. So the top line observations from 2024, because it's still ongoing, election officials are very, very active. As I said before, in just 2 months, we have about 35,000 posts shared across social media platforms. A lot of it is how to register to vote, voter education day, National Voter Registration Day, but a lot of it is also how to spot misinformation. We see an uptick in messaging about process, which is a clear indication that election officials know that voters have a lot of questions. They know that a lot of people question the integrity of the election process and how different parts of the election are shaping election outcomes, be it from making allowing ineligible voters to participate, to making sure that there's no discrepancies in how votes are counted and tabulated and reported. So we see a shift and a more emphasis in those communications where election officials clearly connect the process to the outcome. Here is how we keep elections secure. Here is how this process ensures that election outcomes are secure. A lot of community building and trust, that election officials and poll workers are part of their community. They also play a role in securing elections and ensuring a smooth voter experience and an accurate election process. We also see, and after speaking with election officials, election office tours, inviting people to observe the process and ask their questions and express their healthy skepticism and engage in a conversation is a major trust-building effort that is not captured by just sharing a message of trust on social media. But we capture that because they talk about it online. And also a big effort through those statewide associations to communicate that we have our safeguards in the state of Mississippi, but every state has similar safeguards and they all work. So trusting not only elections in your state, but trusting elections in a state neighboring to yours, especially when the performance of the state is of the opposite party and you don't trust the opposite party because let's face it, we are colored by our partisan or ideologies. So how do we build that community level trust? And by communicating that states have all those safeguards, and you should therefore feel confident that votes cast in another state and nationwide are counted accurately. This process has also allowed us to identify some gaps and some weaknesses in terms of reaching populations of interest that might be underserved, like language minority voters, newly naturalized citizens, students who are less habituated in the act of voting, and they require additional strategies to get information out and to be engaged in the process. We also are able to identify very creative and innovative ways to connect with the community. Voter registration drives are an obvious way, but election officials are going to where voters meet. They're engaging sports teams, they're going to sports events, they're going to bars and restaurants, and they organize events to meet voters. They do food truck rallies, they do concerts, they do a lot of things, both online and offline, to connect with voters and to go and meet them and talk to them about elections and hopefully satisfy a lot of concerns, but also educate them about how elections work and build this community level resilience. And that's what I have. I think I'm 5 minutes short, which is great because I would love to have a conversation and I can answer any other questions you have for me or elaborate on anything I might have passed very quickly. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that, Leah. That was really interesting. So we'll open it up now for questions from people. You're welcome to unmute yourself or raise your hand and ask a question directly, or I already see a couple of questions being posted in the chat. So while you're considering your choices there, let me read one from Laura, Dr. Clark Hunt. Her question, Leah, is how do trust building messages and the term transparency work or not work together? Does this help us trust parties with whom we are not associated?
This is a great question. Thank you. And I will say, first of all, many election officials are elected in partisan elections, and we do observe that partisanship and perceptions of partisanship at the state level a lot. And unfortunately, there are some state election officials who are overtly partisan, and that really shapes how we trust the process. In terms of communications, one emphasis this cycle is highlighting bipartisanship so that election officials and clerks and staff are working on a bipartisan manner to secure elections. So, for example, we do signature verification in a team where we have a Republican and a Democrat, a clerk, right? So how much of bipartisanship is embedded into the process? So it's not just one person using their discretion to benefit their party. And also highlighting that as a process, election administration is nonpartisan. The second one that you mentioned, transparency, and you're right, there's so many efforts to, many election officials use the term radical transparency, that we have all this information out. We're very transparent in how we do things. So more videos about the process, invitations to come to the office. So more emphasis on everything that is going on, streaming, signature verification and processing of ballots, to demonstrate that we have nothing to hide. But one of the challenges is that no matter how transparent you are, some might still not, question what they see is, might be nefarious, right? That's why education is a big part of it. But transparency is definitely integrating those trust building communications. So the elements are, we are transparent, we are bipartisan, we run elections in a nonpartisan manner, we don't benefit one or the other because we are election administrators and we care about this, and our elections are run by professionals, and they are run by people from your community who are your friends and neighbors. So those are the key themes when it comes to those trust building communications.
If I can follow up, because my question is actually kind of related to that, Leah. I mean, you talked a lot about how a key part of solving this problem is taking people's concerns seriously, like listening to them, showing them that you care and that you're not being dismissive or whatever. I wonder though, how much of the problem here is, or how important is the role of the messenger in terms of like these outreach and education efforts? Because it seems to me, I mean, you mentioned over and over, like, voter education and like expert knowledge and so on. But I mean, the very term expert has become a form of derision among lots of people. And I suspect there's a lot of overlap between election deniers, for example, and those who have contempt for like experts or professional knowledge and so on. So it almost feels like there's not, like they're damned if they do, damned if they don't in a way. Is
Yeah,
your
that's it.
research saying
Yeah.
otherwise?
Yeah, that's an important question, and we're doing some work this cycle to better flesh out those messenger effects, and because there's definitely, if you share, let's say, the political party with your election official, if they are elected, you are going to perceive them as a more trusted messenger, right? So how one dimension here is how do we make sure that an election official is perceived as a trusted messenger by everyone? Let's say, Maricopa County or Stephen Richer, who's a Republican, he has been, very famous and very popular among both Democrats and Republicans, because he has been trying to, position himself as a trusted messenger. One thing that election officials are doing, especially at the local level, is that they are partnering with trusted surrogates, because in some cases, there are communities that respond better to other messengers, right? So the goal is to be consistent with the messaging, right? And also identifying those surrogates that can amplify the election officials' work, right? They can share those messages of trust and that elections are secure. But also a big part of it is because, election officials are a big part of the process, and they are the ones that directly interact with voters and they run the election process. So finding effective strategies to, as you said, as you reiterated, satisfy those concerns and to also establish themselves as trusted messengers. One way, let's say, that we have identified this is those states where election boards run elections at the state level, right? And they are bipartisan or nonpartisan, versus a state where the election official is one person, and it is easier to identify, right? And to see whether they use their partisanship or not, or states that have election directors rather than the Secretary of State, who has other responsibilities too, right? So there are different ways and different models that can work, but definitely it's not one person. So something that we hear from election officials is that it takes a community. It's not just us. So we do the work, but we rely on a big community of others who also care about this, right? They care about their community too, and they work with us to spread the message.
Thank you. I think Cliff's been waiting, has a question.
Actually, you almost stole mine, so I'm gonna try and build on that. Do you see some sort of role in maybe education and I don't know, communicating the benefits of journalistic integrity, or some type of return to the value of people who are giving us our information following some sort of, I don't know, anything remotely close to ethics
Yeah,
at all?
thank you. That's a great question. So one thing that I will note is a major recommendation that we give, and many election officials know about this, is that you have to establish a good relationship with your local media network, that they're the ones who have a great potential to amplify your work. And in many cases, because, news deserts and sensationalizing content, we know that many times journalists may not be interested or have the time to seek input from election officials, and they just go with it because they care about, clicks and they have other motivations, and that's a major challenge. So on the election official side, we see a lot of effort to build relationships with the media, but there are also other major stakeholders and news organizations whose explicit focus is to build those relationships between media and journalism and election officials, and train reporters on what the election process means, and why it is very important when they run stories to feature election officials. And in terms of public facing efforts, what my observation from this cycle is that many election officials, also locals and state, they're doing a lot of interviews, they're going out, so they're being featured in articles, but also they do a lot of media to get the word out to voters. Now, in terms of integrity, there are some organizations who do great work and they have standards, there are others who are not, and you can never unfortunately fix that, right? That is definitely a challenge.
Thanks. I appreciate it. This is where I think what we do matters. I appreciate you coming on. Thanks.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions from anybody?
Hey, Leah, I'll take a stab at this. I don't want to be the alarmist, but how quickly can this go badly? Right? We never anticipated in 2019, we never anticipated we would be here today. Right? I mean, things unfolded rapidly. How quickly can this mistrust of election officials disappear and put us into a state of real chaos around trusting elections and the outcomes of those elections?
That is a great question. Thank you. So, I perhaps you have different definitions of what badly means, right? So one obvious outcome is, storming the Capitol and trying to, to overturn election outcomes. Another outcome is harassment and intimidation, so taking action against election officials. And what I will say is that a glimpse of hope is that in 2022, there were several candidates running for the Secretary of State office position, who is the designated chief election officer, who were election deniers, and they lost. So there were a few that won, and there are some who still are in their positions, and they are questioning 2020, which is very, very sad. But voters did not bite, which is good. And that an election denial is concentrated. There's a difference between election denial and confidence and, being skeptical, right? Of course. But if we're talking about the dangerous aspect of it, there is a small population of bad actors who have an agenda, right? But what I will say this cycle, election officials are more prepared. So there is more cooperation across agencies. There is more efforts to put rapid response protocols. There is sadly lack of action from state legislatures to protect election workers and election officials. So there's not much at the state level on, it is illegal to harass and, target election officials, and it is illegal to post misleading and inaccurate information about them. So unfortunately, we're not going to see much of that, but there is some. And so election officers are more prepared. They're preparing for the worst. There is a lot of effort they do a lot of tabletop exercises, cybersecurity exercises. They work with different partners. They work with each other. And this already was happening in previous years, but now it's a little bit more intense, I will say, and more coordinated. And they are preparing for violence on election day. I'm not going to lie. Election officials are, terrified. But one thing I will note is that they are so committed to making it work. But they bring in those partners. So many bring law enforcement into their trainings now. So Georgia was a leader in this. So law enforcement officers were trained in election law and what they should be aware of on election day. They have, rapid response units in almost every state. The cybersecurity agencies working with every state to make sure that processes are in place, both, on the cyber front, but also on the physical front. So election officials are prepared. Now, a big challenge is what happens between election day and certification. This is the biggest concern right now. Election officers are not worried that elections are not going to be run smoothly in terms of, voters casting their ballots, but they're very concerned about efforts to delay the count. Like Mississippi, there's a lawsuit about not counting ballots arriving after election day, even though they are postmarked before election day, right? So disenfranchising those voters. And trying to disrupt the certification. Georgia has, changed their policies, right? So those are the things that really, really keep election officials awake at night, because that can really, really, the longer you wait to announce the results and the longer you wait to finalize the count at the local level before it reaches the certification at the state, that's where confusion is going to increase, doubt is going to increase, and bad actors are going to take advantage of that. So election officers are prepared for this scenario. They're anticipating this is going to be the case. Does that answer your question?
Had to unmute. Yeah, just for some background, I was in Fulton County during all of this brouhaha.
Oh, wow.
I was a Fulton County employee, department head, and so we were pulled into this election piece to try and my role. Each of the department heads was assigned a precinct, and then our role was to go and download all of the voting information surreptitiously, right? So that if something happened to the actual machinery, or if there was some other disruption, we would still have the count, that we could then relay back to the headquarters. And so all of this bubbled up. Rick, you may remember, was there, and then was really under the gun, and a lot of the attacks that came later, all of that was bubbling. And part of what we observed internally was that people did not want to take on these roles anymore. We couldn't find enough poll workers. We couldn't find enough people who wanted to be election officials. And that pressure was pushing them out. And then, as you indicated earlier, the people who have a partisan agenda then were more than willing and eager to jump in. And then we were caught in this position of trying to balance, well, we need this person. There's not a real reason to disqualify them.
Yeah.
And it just created a very tumultuous situation that I think some places are still trying to work through. And I'm not sure what a solution is, but I'm concerned that we have an opportunity to push over one domino and then knock down the whole system. And I was going to say, as librarians, I think we're in a similar unique position. We have that trust with the community, right? We've built a relationship and established a place that is neutral in a sense. And I'm thinking ahead of how we might be able to assist and help election officials use our power in a sense to ameliorate some concerns and help maybe smooth things over for the time being until we can find a more stable ground.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing. And I cannot imagine what it was like to be in Fulton County in 2020. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of turnover. There are a lot of empty positions and lack of willingness to be part of, because you don't want to be harassed and you don't want your family to be harassed. So the risk is definitely higher associated with this job right now. And you know, my experience in Mississippi is that efforts to bring voters into the process have been not very welcome because they're perceived that, oh, you're trying to favor Democrats, which it's so misguided. But I agree with you that the community level, election officials should be part of the process. In my experience at Mississippi State, that's where I was. I don't know if we mentioned that, Brendan. I was at Mississippi State for 7 years before going to Georgetown. So last year was my last year in Mississippi State. So I've worked a lot with election officials, the Secretary of State's office and my Oktibbeha County clerks and election commissioners. Many, you know, there's one layer is that elections are run by older people who may not be thinking about young voters, right? They have a very different view about how elections work, and they think that elections are easy because they know how they work. So that's my experience, and therefore bringing them into the process is useful because they get exposed to other communities that they don't think about, you know, when they think about who is a typical voter. Because they will say, oh, young voters don't vote. We should not have, you know, polling places on campuses because young voters don't vote and they don't care. But it's not that's not the whole story. But another thing is also finding ways to bring the process into the community, right? So in 2022, something that I did with my students, I brought them to the election office and they did a mock logic and accuracy testing, so that the technology check, right? And then they started asking questions. Okay, how about this? How about this? Can you rig this? Can you rig that? And then that was so observing the students ask these questions and, you know, infer from that, you know, it's actually very hard to rig the voting machine, right? To change the vote outcomes. You know, I didn't think about that. So again, I will highlight this over and over, that what I hear from election officials is that the burden is on the community to build that trust. So they do the work, but it's also on us to, you know, do our part. So if you think about what the role of the library is, yeah, do some common programming, invite your election officials, bring them in, or try to find ways to, you know, do some programming around elections and voting, and bring different messengers from that and be as inclusive as possible so that, you know, you're not perceived as you're taking one side or the other,
For sure.
right?
Yeah.
I think that's very, very valuable. And I strongly believe that higher education institutions have a big role to play in raising awareness and building a civic mission. That's part of what we do. Is we are citizens, and part of the citizenship involves voting. And universities have to play that role too. And I don't know, at least at Mississippi State, my experience was not very rosy in making that happen, but we did things, you know, through political science and through the library to do some of that.
We might have time for like one more question if there's any. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Going once? Okay, Cliff, we'll give you the last stab here.
I can always come up with a question. I moved to Hattiesburg 2 years ago from one of the bluest counties in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. And definite I don't want to say culture shock, but it's just a difference of availability of information. If you take advantage of a television option or listen to the radio or anything like that, it is extremely difficult to get an opinion that is not ostensibly owned by a political party. I mean, that's the hurdle. And I don't know how, I haven't seen anyone outside of maybe the French who have come up with a good solution for it. So I'm trying to figure out, you know, it's just an uncomfortable place to be as an American, to have all of your news outlets, almost all of your news outlets, owned by a political party, be it on either side. It's just not, I mean, how do you jump that hurdle?
Yeah, thank you for sharing it. That has been a major frustration for me, because, you know, in research and in the space, we spend a lot of attention talking about battleground states, right, and how things work in battleground states, and we states like Mississippi, because they're solid red, they're systematically ignored, and that's always something that I raise when I talk to others, because Mississippi is very exotic, but nobody really does anything to, you know, to study and improve the ecosystem in states like Mississippi, because, you know, they consider them they're going to be red forever, right? What's the point? And that's clearly a major problem, which is why I argue that's where election officials can play a role, because they do have those networks, and they do have the platform to talk about elections, right? At least when it comes to election processes, right? They cannot talk about they should not talk about politics, and they should not talk about candidates other than who are the candidates running for your ballot. But they should be more involved in getting the information out. Now, I know that in some counties, like the sample ballots are posted in newspapers, right? But there should be more active efforts in making those connections. Now, I also know that in states like Mississippi, election administration is severely underfunded. There are jurisdictions in the state that election officials don't even have a printer or a scanner. They have a fax machine, right? So that brings another conversation about building an infrastructure where election officials have the tools they need to do the work they do, right? Because right now, all they do is processing absentees, right? And finding poll workers and training poll workers. They're not going to have the time to go on TV or on radio because they don't have another person to do that, right? They have to do the work. And that's a major, major challenge. And there are jurisdictions that, they serve thousands of voters with 2 people running the office. And clearly that's a problem. In Mississippi specifically, also, election duties are split between the clerk and the election commission. The election commission is part-time. And, they have like a specific time that they work, and it's allocated on specific, purpose. And therefore that also can explain how much outreach they do, because it may be beyond the scope of their duties because they don't have the time to do it, So there are a lot of layers in this, but that's where I argue the Secretary of State's office has to jump in. And Michael Washington has been doing overall a good job in being out there, definitely more active, but he's an individual who is, you can clearly tell, where he lies, right? And he was in the state legislature, right? So a little bit more effort to spread the word in different channels, and educate voters. That's something that is definitely needed.
Well, thank you so much, Leah, for taking the time to talk to us about this fascinating topic. We're not gonna keep you any longer than you already have given any more time than you've already given us. So thank you so much for those that stuck around here to the bitter end. I think someone had shared Leah's personal webpage on there. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer a follow-up question if something occurs to you in the next day or so. But in the meantime, this recording will be accessible on the Misinformation resource page that I'm putting together as part of my Carnegie Whitney grant. So you can have access to it at a later date if you're so inclined. So thanks again, everyone. I hope everyone has a great rest of your week. Leah, we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me, and great to meet you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
Bye.